So, how many here for the first time? I see many familiar faces. Yeah, that's the first timer. You guys are first time. And how did you hear about this event?
I met Narada in Central Park.
Okay, cool. And what about you?
We found on Google.
Google.
Wow.
Yeah.
You don't know how much that makes us happy. We put so much into internet marketing. We got one.
So does anybody know who came up with this? Who coded this? That's a trick question, I just made that up. You might be thinking
What was the question?
who came up with this quote? When our spirituality disconnects us from our spirituality.
You did.
So basically I wanted to sum up spiritual bypassing in like maybe a sentence of what that means. So I'll tell you how I got the idea to present on this topic. I was speaking with one of my friends, and they were saying that such and such a group, they're like spiritual bypassers. So I asked him, what do you mean by that? And he said, they're just pretentious. And I was thinking, is that really spiritual bypassing, to be pretentious? What do you guys think? I'd like to start with, what is your understanding or definition of spiritual bypassing? Have you heard that term before? Okay, so you've heard that before.
Yeah.
Anybody not heard that? So, some yes, some no. Okay. Yeah. How would you define spiritual bypassing?
I think it can happen if you're using spirituality as like a painkiller to sort of like avoid some emotional problems. But I don't know, like I think it can be very, very complicated, and I'm really excited to hear this because I think a lot of the times also people who we think aren't spiritually bypassing are bypassing something because they're like denying certain aspects of reality also. So I think it's...
And vice versa.
Yeah.
You said you might think they're not bypassing, but they are, or they are bypassing and you wouldn't think they... Did I say the same thing twice? But
yeah,
the
I
opposite,
think, like,
basically.
Like spiritual people can like use spirituality to bypass like certain emotional issues, but then people who don't have any spiritual practice maybe are using certain like models that they have of reality to deny like fear of death or something like that, or different things, like they're denying the spiritual realm too. So,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Any other sort of definition you have of what spiritual bypassing means to you, I guess?
For me, what comes to my mind is because in the beginning of my spiritual life, I've been exposed to this broad new age kind of movement that is going on, and for me, bypassing is like being a pretender. Pretender, practitioner of a so-called spiritual path, basically a watered-down spirituality, which is used for not for the right means, but for self-aggrandizement, for some personal motive.
Okay.
Many
Yeah.
do this.
Yeah.
And the result is not very good.
Absolutely. So many faith traditions across the world, they all have their flavor of what you just described. Any other thoughts of what spiritual bypassing would mean? So this term was coined by one transpersonal psychologist called John Wellwood. He's also a Buddhist. So he came up with this term, spiritual bypassing, in his book, Toward a Psychology of Awakening. So since then it's sort of caught on and everybody's using this word spiritual bypassing, and so how he defined spiritual bypassing was the tendency to use spiritual ideas to sidestep or avoid facing certain emotional issues or psychological wounds or some unfinished development tasks that we need to sort of address. So when you use spirituality to sort of avoid that, or as an excuse to sort of bypass or jump over that phase and try to move on to the next phase, that's how he used the word spiritual bypassing. And like I said, in every tradition, faith tradition, you'll see some flavor of it. And in our Hare Krishna movement, there's one leader, Mahatma Prabhu. He does series of spiritual bypassing. But this topic, by the way, I wanted to sort of give you an intro. So divided this discussion. This is meant to be a discussion, not so much as a monologue. So feel free to jump in with your ideas and anything you want to add. So I've divided this whole presentation into two sections. So first is we'll sort of dissect the different aspects of spiritual bypassing, and the second half of this discussion is meant to be based on Bhagavad Gita. And how does Bhagavad Gita, the ancient scripture, talk about this concept of spiritual bypassing? And you'll be surprised as how much of spiritual bypassing is there in Bhagavad Gita. Until I started doing some research, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing how I just didn't think of it that way. So that's how I've divided this presentation into two halves. So the thing is, this is the quote I wanted to share. Sorry, I didn't share the screen. So this is the, do you want to read again? Maybe you can make it more interactive if you like. You can
Yeah,
read.
for sure. Spiritual bypassing. The tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks.
So, and this is how he defines John Wellwood in his book. So, see, the thing is, we all come to spiritual life from different backgrounds, different upbringings, different sort of psychological sort of imprints. So we bring all of that in spiritual life. And what happens is when we come to spiritual life, we bring all of those baggage with us, our emotional sort of traumas, wounds, psychological wounds, all of that comes with us in spiritual life. And as we go on, as we continue in our spiritual journey, we somehow magically believe that all of that is supposed to go away on its own. Some of it does go away on its own. So we somehow magically sort of expect that, okay, I'm now a spiritualist. So now in my spiritual practice, by the virtue of my spiritual practice, whatever emotional wounds or any trauma we carry automatically goes away. Yes, it is true, but then the other aspect is there has to be some conscious effort in addressing these issues. And at the risk of sounding cliched, like God helps who helps themselves, as you might have heard. So there's some amount of effort that is needed from our end also. So, and yes, spiritual life is, I mean, it's a powerful sort of transformative experience. All of these issues sort of come to the surface for us to sort of address them. So we enter spirituality and then we expect these things to go away, and when they don't, then we're confronted with this dilemma. Either you face it or you're just in denial. So that's typically, I've seen a lot of spiritualists there in this denial mode. You kind of sweep that under the rug. Because if you try to confront it, then our faith gets challenged. And this is a really interesting sort of point, that when we confront our weaknesses in this Hare Krishna tradition, we call that anarthas. When we are sort of confronted with that, there's a sort of possibility of our faith getting challenged. And that's why a lot of people are in denial, sort of like, no, that doesn't exist. Because if spirituality works, this is supposed to go away on its own, so maybe it doesn't exist, the problems don't exist. So to protect our faith, we enter this denial mode, and this denial mode further leads to this fanaticism. So I like this definition of fanaticism by Carl Jung, this Swedish psychologist. He says all fanaticism is repressed doubt. So in this tradition, Hare Krishna tradition, there's a really nice sort of leader. His name is Ravindra Swarup. And he defines fanaticism as overcompensation for lack of faith. I found that definition, yeah.
Yeah, this made me think about you only need to defend that which you don't know.
Excellent.
If it's obvious, you don't need to defend it.
Yes. So sort of piggybacking on that point, you don't know something, you have this need to sort of defend that or justify yourself. And then Ravindra Swarup, he defines that as overcompensation for lack of faith. So when you don't have faith in the process or something, you have this need to sort of make a display of it just so that you want to make people sort of aware that, okay, this works and this is how I feel, and that's like fanaticism. So that's what happens when you're confronted with your sort of your weaknesses, and then you try to sort of work your way around that in an unhealthy way. So that leads to fanaticism or this lack of faith, and you're trying to compensate that. And this goes on for years. We go on for years in spiritual life not addressing those deep-seated problems, those underlying problems that we might have, we might carry with us either before entering a spiritual life or in the process of sort of in our journey, in our spiritual journey. We might, along the way, we might become some anarthas or some sort of weaknesses or contaminations, as we like to call it in this tradition. And we can go for years sort of not being aware of that. And I can stress this, like in every faith tradition, you'll see some leader who's been in that tradition for 20, 30 years. And after 30 years, all of a sudden they're like, boop, gone. They're confronted with all those things. And I can see you smiling. So it's like such a strange phenomenon that you see that someone practicing for like 30, 40 years and it's just all of a sudden they hit a wall and then they just leave. That's because of those inner sort of challenges that we haven't taken time to address. Yeah.
What are you referring to?
What am I referring to in terms of?
Like you say they leave the practice.
Yeah, leave the practice, or they just sort of, be on the down low for like whatever number of years, or their own sort of steadiness is sort of shaken in some way. And we'll discuss what are those things, what leads to that and so on. So the point is we carry those sort of inner disturbances that we haven't taken time to address. And spiritual bypassing in one sense is that sort of phenomenon which happens where you haven't taken time to address those inner sort of weaknesses. And a lot of times what happens is, especially when it comes to emotional health, we might feel that emotional health or taking care of emotional health is different or separate from spiritual advancement. And I'm saying this from sort of my interactions with fellow practitioners, either from this tradition and other traditions. There's this general tendency that, okay, emotional health, especially therapy, emotional health, all of that can be seen as a taboo. Like, therapy, like, why do I need to go to therapy and things like that. I'm a spiritualist and, just chant Prabhu, it goes away, or just read, you're not reading enough and things like that. So emotional health can be seen as separate from spiritual advancement. But actually, if you see a holistic spiritual advancement takes care of all these issues, if you sort of take time to sort of work on your issues and take help from your spiritual practice, it's a holistic process. So a lot of times we then take to hiding behind like our spiritual practice or a spiritual attire or dress or behaving in a certain way to make up for the fact that I'm lacking in something. And we might not even be aware of that, but subconsciously it gives us this immediate boost. You dress a certain way and in a second you're like, okay, I'm this way. And subconsciously we have this script that we want, a script of ourselves that we want people to think of as like, I am such and such a person, I am this way, that way, and you want people to sort of, subconsciously you hand the script to everybody else, and this is how I want you to think of me. And all of that is because this inner sort of emptiness we're carrying, and sort of we project that and we hide behind our dress or the way we speak, and like now I'm a spiritualist, I have a new way of speaking, I have a new way of behaving, and so on. So we hide behind that as opposed to working on the actual issue, and this leads to sidestepping and avoiding all those emotional trauma, emotional things that, and this avoidance actually allows us to think that we are more advanced than we are. Because if you're confronting this, then you have to accept that I'm not as advanced as I thought I was. And it's such an uncomfortable thing. So the convenient way is just, and all of this happens really subconsciously. You might not be aware of these things. Subconsciously, you're just sort of making a detour and avoiding that point or those topics that make us really uncomfortable. And a lot of times it happens, I'm speaking from my interactions and my personal experiences. Some spiritualists might feel that it's below our dignity to sort of accept any emotional shortcomings or address any emotional shortcomings. Like even the fact that, okay, if someone tells you, I think in your conversations, either someone tells you or you tell someone, I think it would help you for you to see a therapist. And I said that to someone because they came and sort of confided in me, and I've known that person for a long time, and I sort of suggested that, and that was like as if like the most blasphemous thing I'd ever said. Like, oh my God, how dare you suggest that to me? And of course I'd said that in a non-judgmental way, not so much as I think you need therapy, but more like I think it's really helpful. It's just really, that really sort of made me think it's such a taboo to even talk about those things. It's below my dignity to somehow even mention those things. So what happens is because of all of this mix, we have those issues and we're trying to address those issues, and when those issues come up, then we try to use some spiritual explanations to dismiss all of those needs that we have or shortcomings. We might use scriptural explanations or references to dismiss or belittle or sort of have an explanation for everything. And I've had this happen to me, I've done this to others, and it's a mix of things where we sort of try to justify all of our shortcomings by some spiritual explanations, and or basically we try to rationalize and trivialize our material needs. Anytime our needs come up, we just trivialize it, or it's just as if it's something really insignificant. You're not supposed to be feeling that way, and if you feel that way, you're like a lesser of a spiritualist, and that's sort of like a subconscious sort of conditioning that can sometimes be imposed, that if you sort of feel that way, you're like a lesser of a spiritualist, you're supposed to be above all of those things. And this leads to something called as escapism, where you're trying to escape certain harsh realities by living in an alternate sort of dimension, also known as being delusional. So it's easy to be escapist. And also the thing is, what makes this escapism really interesting is, even before entering spiritual life, some of us might have gone through some amount of trauma or something really, it's like a big catastrophic sort of event that pushes us towards spiritual life, Krishna consciousness. And Krishna himself says that Artha Jigyasur Artati Jnani Cha Bharata Shabha, that 4 kinds of people take to Krishna consciousness, spiritual life. One of them is Artha, which is distressed. So some event happens in our life and that sort of pushes us, okay, I need to sort of be serious about my spiritual life or look for some spiritual, and that's not a bad thing. But what happens is we take to spiritual life, we become really sort of fired up because we're desperately trying to escape all of that which we're leaving behind. So we take on to a spiritual life in an unreal speed or in an unrealistic sort of momentum, and it's easy to mistake that as our sincerity, but in reality you're just escaping certain conditioning you're trying to leave behind. So externally it might seem, okay, this person is really like fired up and like they're advancing really fast. But the reality could be that you're being an escapist. Because you're trying to enjoy the material world. It didn't work, it didn't go your way. Now you're trying to sort of enter spiritual life with that same sort of intensity with which you're trying to enjoy material life. So when material life is frustrated, you direct that tendency or that sort of desire to enjoy in a spiritual way. So one takes a spiritual life in an unrealistic speed, and it's often sort of at a speed which can often be above your pay grade. And that's where the whole problem is. You're sort of, imagine you're running a marathon, and right off the bat, first 5 minutes, you're just sprinting along, and you're thinking, great, this is how fast I can run. And then after 10 minutes, you realize it's not realistic. I can't run the whole marathon at this speed. So you take on to a spiritual practice at a speed which is way above your pay grade, and that's what my understanding of spiritual bypassing is. And sooner or later, you have to sort of downsize or sort of scale back on how fast or like your sort of way of moving along in spiritual life. So similar such incident happened long ago, about 5,000 years ago maybe, to a yogi who had a similar experience, who had an escapist mindset. A certain traumatic event happened, and that yogi wasn't like an Ashtanga yogi. You know Ashtanga yoga, right? Not that kind of a yogi, Ashtanga yogi, or like a Dhyana yogi or Jnana yogi. This yogi actually was a warrior, and his name was Arjuna. And Arjuna, what happened was he was put into this really interesting fix where he was a law enforcement officer. In our colloquial lingo, we might call him a law enforcement officer, and he has to step up to the scene to sort of curb law and order. And the people who's trying to sort of arrest happen to be his own family members. Now he's in a fix. It's his family relationships versus his duty. So that kind of trauma leads to this escapist mindset where he is sort of, and in this picture you see Arjuna is kneeling down, and the person who's standing is Krishna, the supreme, the divine Krishna. So Arjuna happens to be his confidential associate of Krishna. So this whole book, Bhagavad Gita, is a dialogue between these two about how to sort of, what is spiritual bypassing and how not to do it. And this whole book starts with that point where Arjuna sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Self-prescribes, or what's the word I'm looking for? He self-prescribes this sort of spiritual plan that this is what I'm going to do, and he sort of reveals that to Krishna. And immediately Krishna senses that, saying, this doesn't look right. You're sort of trying, there is a sense of escapist mindset where materially he's frustrated, and now he's taking to spiritual life in an unrealistic speed. So Arjuna proposes, instead of law and order, being a warrior, instead of doing tough things, why don't I just leave this battlefield? I'll be a mendicant, how about that? I'll be and in the Vedic tradition, being a mendicant or a sannyasi is considered to be a really high platform where you're really detached, you have no material needs. So he proposes that I'll live by begging, I'll be a mendicant, I'll live in the forest, I'll be like one of those people who sort of, like a saintly people, and I'll just be in the forest, and and that's my plan, and that's the best way. And Krishna says, nah, that's like a terrible idea. And in chapter 3, Krishna explains why that's a bad idea. So in the first few verses of chapter 3, Krishna says that, does anybody not know the three modes, material nature? Anyway, I'll break it down. So what Krishna says is that all around us is this material energy, and this material energy is characterized by three modes, or three modalities, meaning just think of energy having different bands of energy spectrum, right? In energy, there's different energy bands. Or just like in light, there's different bands of energy, like light. Like that, in material nature, there's three modalities. So Krishna is explaining that when one comes in contact with this material energy, by this contact, one develops picks up certain qualities by association by this material energy. And by picking up these qualities, one develops a certain desire, depending on what modality, whether it's like Rajas, Tamas, or Sattva. One develops a certain desire by those qualities, and those desires develop a certain kind of inclination or propensity to act, like a predisposition to act a certain way. Like, have you wondered, like you look around and some people, they do certain things and you're like, why would you do that? What makes you act in that way? It's like just doesn't make sense. And you look around, certain people do certain things. So Krishna is explaining that's because of your karna guna sangasya. When you associate with material energy, and because that we absorb certain qualities, and these qualities sort of create these desires, and these desires are what push us to act a certain way. So Krishna is saying that you've picked up a certain sort of nature by your association. So you might think, okay, I have this propensity to act a certain way. So what's the solution? Best solution is I'm not going to act. Problem solved. So that's what Arjuna is thinking. I'm just not going to act. So Krishna is saying the problem is your senses might be controlled, but your mind is dwelling on the sense objects. So Krishna is saying you'll simply be a pretender. Like, for example, let's say I'm addicted to cookies. I can think about cookies all day long. I'm thinking cookies, and I just keep eating like truckloads of cookies. So I think, okay, to solve this problem, I'm just not gonna sort of engage in that act of eating, and that's what solve my problem. I'm just gonna not physically eat it. So a month goes by, I'm not doing it, I'm not eating it, but I'm sort of always I'm sort of meditating on cookies. Every single second I'm thinking cookies, like maybe chocolate chip cookies or oat, whatever that is, and like, is it chewy or is it crunchy? So Krishna is saying that's not a full transformation of heart. You're simply being a pretender. So externally your senses might be controlled, but your mind is still dwelling on the sense objects. So Krishna is saying that's the form of spiritual bypassing. So the best solution is, Krishna is saying, one should act according to the level one's at, but act in such a way one regulates that act, and sort of, there's a word we like to use in this tradition, dovetail, which is like you incorporate all of your actions, you regulate that in a spiritual way. And by doing that, that's a healthy way of sort of rising above a lower level. So the best way to rise above a lower level to a higher is sort of act according to your level. And one of the saints in this tradition, he explains that Arjuna wanted to be a swami, or like a sannyasi, like a person in the highest order. And before that stage comes the stage of grihastha, or people who are like family people who have families, jobs and things. So one of the acharyas, or one of the saints in this line, Vishwanath, he says that instead of being a dishonest sannyasi or dishonest sort of such a holy man, you'd rather be an honest family person. You go about your, you go about your daily life, your job responsibilities. You'd rather be a sincere family person than a dishonest holy man. You know, look at me, and then back behind the scenes, you're sort of caught in some scandals and whatever that is. So Krishna is trying to explain that to Arjuna. That's a more realistic stage or more realistic path or way of progressing than a really unrealistic way of sort of trying to forge ahead really, really fast. And then Krishna goes on to further explain. Again, would anybody like to sort of read so that this is not like a monologue, one-sided? Yeah, you can read the English.
Even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature, for everyone follows the nature he has acquired from the three modes. What can repression accomplish?
So Krishna's making the same point here. So you've developed a certain personality, certain inclinations, a predisposition. By nature, you're like a really physical, like a law enforcement kind of a person. And not to go too much into the personality types as per Bhagavad Gita, but one of the personality types is Kshatriya. They're like little macho kind of people. They like sports, military, being in the army, and like law and order and things like that. And that's how Arjuna was, like a really macho kind of a person. And now such a person who's like really like, you know, that kind of a person, now he's proposing that I'll, you know, go to the forest, retire, like sort of meditate, go begging. It's not realistic to see such a person do that. So Krishna is saying, what can repression accomplish? And then Krishna goes on to say that in the 18th chapter, he says that under illusion, you're now declining to act as per my advice, but you'll act all the same. In 18th chapter, you'll ultimately act the same way as you've been acting before. So might as well do it in a more genuine way as opposed to sort of artificially trying to take up to a level which is like unsustainable, unrealistic, and then sort of revert back to your older sort of level. So this one way why people sort of, we discussed a few points as to why one can sort of take to the spiritual bypassing mindset. One is that escaping mentality. You're trying to escape certain condition, certain situation, certain duty you have, and you don't want to do that, and you justify that with some spiritual explanation. Like, even in this tradition, in many traditions, there have been certain people who give up their family life by trying to use spiritual explanations of why they should do it, and ultimately they revert back to where they were before. You know, they were family people, they try to be holy men, and they revert back to being family people. That's because you're trying to escape certain responsibilities. And Krishna makes that point in chapter 18 also, that if one renounces one's duty out of illusion, then you're in the mode of ignorance. And if you don't understand what this ignorance, passion, goodness, these are three modalities we can maybe discuss at a later point. But he says that that's because of tamas. And if you give up your prescribed duty because it's troublesome, that is because of rajas, or the mode of passion and drive. So one is supposed to sort of do our duty in a more selfless way. And by doing that, one gets sufficiently purified, and then one can go to a more higher platform which is more realistic and sustainable. So it's either because of that, escapist mentality, because of that we do spiritual bypassing, or the other point. But before I say that, any points you want to add so that it's not such a monotonous, like a speech that I'm giving? So far, anything you want to add? Yes.
Yeah, one thing I have noticed is I feel like I have two voices in my head. There's kind of like, let's call it the original voice that's been there forever. And then now there's kind of like a spiritual voice that is like commenting on the original voice. It's like taking everything that I read in the books, and it's like applying it to the voice in my head. And recently I feel like I finally recognized that, like, oh, the second voice, that's also just a voice. You know? And I feel like before I had that realization, I was doing some spiritual bypassing.
I see.
Because I was like, oh, well, like that, you shouldn't be afraid of that. That's done.
Yeah.
You know, but like, yet the fear was there.
Okay, that's a good point. Did you want to add something? Or yeah.
Well, I just wanted to appreciate that you brought up Arjuna from Bhagavad Gita, because his role is that he's an example, and even he's wanting to escape.
Yeah.
And I think it's really like the most natural thing for a human to want to escape, because if we are spiritual and we're not material, but then we're stuck in this material body, of course, like subconsciously we're going to be thinking like, how do I get out of here? How do I not have to deal with this? And so it's kind of a relief that even Arjuna, who's been put in this position where he's the example, he's like the student, he's like, you know, basically monkey see, monkey do. If we copy what Arjuna does, we're in good hands. And so it's a relief that even he questions, like, can't I just run away?
Yeah.
Just echoes that natural feeling.
Yeah, and before you came, I was just sharing that when I was thinking more about this topic, I got this idea. I was talking to someone who suggested that such a certain group of people are spiritual bypassers because they're pretentious, and that got me thinking of what exactly is spiritual bypassing. That's when it struck me like, oh my God, Bhagavad Gita is a perfect book which talks about spiritual bypassing, and Krishna is like the perfect guide how he teaches you how not to bypass, because this is exactly what Arjuna was doing. He's trying to sort of avoid certain uncomfortable situations and artificially putting himself in a higher level. So one reason is like you're avoiding certain troublesome situation. And the other reason could be like pride. Sometimes what happens is when we take to a spiritual tradition, our pride and desire to be acknowledged is disguised as sincerity. So you might see a practitioner, they seem really sincere, and you might think he or she is so sincere. It could also be their own pride and desire to be acknowledged or validated. A lot of our, like going back to the traumas, emotional traumas we carry, one thing I've seen that this is so common, I've seen this happen so many times in this tradition. There's this concept of guru or like a teacher or mentor. So a lot of times we might have certain, for lack of a better word, like daddy issues or issues with your father growing up, like either abandonment issues and things like that. So when you have these abandonment issues and you come to a spiritual tradition, now you're looking for a teacher, you start expecting that your teacher is now like your dad. They'll emotionally sort of give you a pep talk, or sort of, you know, pat your head, give you a kiss on your forehead, put you to your bed and tuck you, you know, in your bed and so on. I'm sort of exaggerating it, but of course subconsciously some of us might have this tendency to approach a guru as in a more like as if they're looking for like a father part 2. So that's because of all these issues we carry, like these abandonment issues and so on, and we project that on our guru, and our guru is someone who's supposed to give me a sense of, you know, validation, and a guru is supposed to make me feel good, and or like a guru is a therapist and so on. So again, it's an example of how we bring all those emotional issues. So our pride can also be disguised as sincerity. That's the second point we're discussing. First is the escapist mindset. Second is pride. And one of the ancient saints in this tradition also talks about this, how pride can so easily be mistaken as sincerity. One becomes really eager and enthusiastic, and especially when you're newer in any spiritual tradition, you're really like fired up and you sort of, you know, go forging ahead. So there's one saint, one acharya, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, and he talks about this in his Madhura Kadambini. He calls it Utsahamai, or as I like to call it, PDS, Pure Devotee Syndrome. So when you sort of enter a spiritual tradition, and the example, anyway, okay, I'll give an example. There was one person during Prabhupada's time, you probably would know, you can give better. That person started learning Sanskrit, and in 6 months they thought that they can sort of correct Prabhupada's translations, because, you know, they've been learning Sanskrit and now they can sort of go and sort of correct their teacher. And so anyway, an example of Utsahamai or the pure devotee syndrome is you've taken to a spiritual tradition maybe 3 months, 6 months, and you feel like, okay, I'm almost there, just a few more months and I'll be like at the top, I'll be the holiest of the holy. So that's Utsahamai. So that tendency of sort of overly enthusiastic can also lead us to being in that, putting ourselves in that situation where one finds oneself sort of putting ourselves in a situation which is more above our pay grade. So in this regard, there's a really nice verse that my teacher loves to quote a lot, and he says that would anybody like to read this verse?
steadiness in one's own position is declared to be actual piety, whereas deviation from one's position is considered impiety. In this way, the two are definitely ascertained.
So my teacher, my guru, really loves to quote this, Vesve Adhikari Yanishta, that real religion or real religiousness is sticking to your level of advancement and trying to do best at that level. And if you try to do the opposite, viparyayastu doshasta, then that's considered as a fault. If you're trying to artificially do more than what you're capable of, then that's considered as a dosha or viparyayastu doshasta. So it's such a nice verse that I love from Srimad Bhagavatam, that's real steadiness, is acting according to your own pay grade, your own adhikar, as we say in this tradition, your own level of qualification. So if you try to do more, then that's considered as a fault. So then often again, coming back to our point of spiritual bypassing, we find either ourselves or others around us trying to do more and then struggling with that. And then with that struggle brings a lot of inner sort of challenges that we are confronted with and so on. So staying at our level and acting at our level also means addressing the needs which are there at our level. Because what happens is when you put yourself at a higher level, then that also means your needs should also be there as per that level. But then what happens is Janaki was sort of saying you're sort of caught between the two levels. Either you be in the higher level and your needs are also as per that level, then that's fine. Or you're acting as per your level and your needs are according to your level. But then we put ourselves in a higher level, but our needs are still there, which belong to our lower platform, and that causes this dissonance, this cognitive dissonance that we go across. So it's helpful to sort of be realistic of where we are and try to address the needs of our level. And in addressing that, and like we discussed before, a lot of people think addressing our needs or even our emotional health is separate from spiritual advancement. Actually, a holistic spiritual advancement, as Satyanand Swami, one of the Swamis in this tradition, talks about, our spiritual, holistic spiritual life it's like a four-chambered heart. Just like a heart has four chambers, right? If one of the chambers of the heart experiences a blockage, the whole heart experiences a heart attack. So he says that the heart of spiritual life has four chambers, like one of the chambers like a spiritual chamber, the other is like a good social chamber, the third is like an emotional, and the fourth is like spiritual, emotional, social, and physical. And he says if one of these sort of areas are neglected, then that affects the whole spiritual life. For example, let's say if emotionally, spiritually, socially you're doing good, but physically you're not doing good. Like if anybody's had severe dental problems, I've had this few years ago, forget your japa, just that goes out of the window. You're having this intense pain in your jaw. And if someone tells you, Prabhu, just chant, it'll go away, it's really hard for us to, unless you're at a pure Rupa Goswami level. So if one of these areas are not sort of functioning, that affects the whole spiritual life. So we might artificially try to sort of neglect that, and that affects so being at our level also means that we try to address the needs of our level. So this happened to me, I was having this discussion with someone maybe a year or two ago. And that person was saying that, I'm living such an austere life, I'm sleeping 2 hours a day, that's, and even my guru said that, oh, you're living such an austere life, you're sleeping 2 hours a night. And I was thinking, but for those of you who don't understand austerity, in this tradition, austerity means basically you're trying to sort of rise above the bodily level. So they were telling me that I'm living such an austere life, I'm just sleeping 2 hours a night, 2 or 3 hours a night. And I was thinking, that's not being austere. In fact, Krishna says, don't do that. In chapter 6, he says that one who sleeps too much or too little cannot be a yogi. So somehow we think that if I sleep less, then I'm being austere, I'm being a little more. So these are some of the misconceptions we carry, that if I do such and such a physically crazy thing, that I'm automatically really advanced. Besides this person, I've also met other monks, brahmacharis, who took pride in sleeping just 3 hours a night. Because of course Prabhupada, the founder of this movement, he was on another platform. He would sleep like just 2 hours a night. So somehow we think if I sleep less, I'm more advanced. So that also is a form, the flavor of spiritual bypassing. And Krishna's clearly in that purport where Prabhupada says, in the purport, the verse where Krishna says if one sleeps too much or too little, one cannot be a yogi. And that Prabhupada says a gold standard of 6 hours. So at least give yourself six hours. Some might need 7. Don't beat yourself up if you need 7 hours a night. But 6, that's the gold standard. And some people might think, oh, I'm just sleeping 2 hours a night. Oh, I'm such an austere person. So I was thinking, how is that austerity anyway? So, and Krishna also makes this point in the 6th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Would anybody like to read this? The English? Yes.
There is no possibility of one's becoming a yogi, O Arjuna, if one eats too much or eats too little, sleeps too much or does not sleep enough.
Mm-hmm.
He who is regulated in his habits of eating, sleeping, recreation, and work can mitigate all material pains by practicing the yoga system.
So here we see again Krishna says that one who sleeps too much or does not sleep enough. So one has to be balanced. So again, going back to the founder of this Hare Krishna tradition, Srila Prabhupada, one of his early students shares his memory about how Nanda Kumar Prabhu, he really liked sort of doing yoga and eating like fresh, organic, raw diet, prasadam, like raw foods. And other fellow students, devotees were giving him a hard time. You're doing yoga, you're in Maya. And he used to like eating good raw food because that suited his body. And again, they were giving him a hard time. Prasadam is prasadam, you should eat. It's just, you can eat whatever you want. So he asked Prabhupada, the founder, is it okay for me to eat any? So prasadam is spiritual food. So by technicality, when you eat spiritual food, it's sanctified food, it's spiritually uplifts you. So somehow we feel that, okay, one only focuses on the spiritual aspect, even if the body doesn't sort of take it too well. So somehow the conception is if it's prasadam, if it's spiritual food, it's good no matter what you eat. So he asked Prabhupada, the founder, that I like to do yoga, it just makes me feel good, it keeps my body in shape, is that okay? And Prabhupada said, yeah, that's totally fine. And then he also asked, what about the prasadam, the food, is it true that you can eat whatever you want as long as it's spiritual? And Prabhupada said, yes, if you're Rupa Goswami. Rupa Goswami is one of the saints who are at a really, really high platform. And Prabhupada jokingly said, yes, if you're at that platform, you can eat whatever you want, even poison, and you'll survive. But then he said, for the most of us, one has to be realistic. One has to see what kind of food sort of suits our body, and accordingly, it's okay to sort of prepare certain foodstuffs which suits our body. So again, these are all different flavors of spiritual bypassing we might unknowingly sort of see around. You're supposed to eat whatever, and it's spiritual, and then your body goes through a lot of, hard time adjusting to that. So like this, we see that in our being, there's a lower dimension to our existence, and there's a higher dimension to our existence. And often in the spiritual bypassing works in such a way that one only focuses on the higher dimension of our existence. Because we're in spirituality and one has to sort of neglect that. It makes sense. You're supposed to rise above the lower dimension and move to a higher dimension. Yes, in theory it makes sense, but it's a process. It's not a switch, like an on and on-off switch. I'm here now and the next second I'm there. It's like a process. So there's a nice verse that I love, which talks about how one has to consider both these dimensions of our existence, the lower and the higher dimensions, and not prematurely sort of, as we say, throw the baby out with the bathwater, not just prematurely sort of throw everything out and, okay, now I'm a spiritualist. Again, would anybody like to read? Nobody? Yes.
Only one who can learn the process of nescience and that of transcendent knowledge side by side can transcend the influence of repeated birth and death and enjoy the full blessings of immortality. One should know perfectly the personality of Godhead Sri Krishna and its transcendental name, form, qualities, and pastimes, as well as the temporary material creation with its temporary demigods, men, and animals. When one knows these, he surpasses death and the ephemeral cosmic manifestation with it. And in the eternal kingdom of God, he enjoys his eternal life of bliss and knowledge.
So the end, it talks about eternal life of bliss and knowledge, yes, but then before that is also the fact that we acknowledge these two sides. So the process of nations basically means that which is not transcendental knowledge. Excuse me. So one has to sort of acknowledge both of these lower dimension of our being and the higher dimension, and it's a process, and eventually we'll get there. So there's this tendency, again, talking about this prematurely renouncing things, or prematurely, especially something that which is considered material, prematurely things that, okay, let me sort of discard that, and that leads to this sort of unhealthy stage when one just artificially is trying to sort of rise above a platform which is just unrealistic. And another nice verse I like is this one. Anyone else like to read? I'll read it.
When one is not attached to anything, but at the same time accepts everything in relation to Krishna, one is rightly situated above possessiveness. On the other hand, one who rejects everything without knowledge of its relationship to Krishna is not as complete in his renunciation.
So, going back to Prabhupada, the founder of the Hare Krishna tradition, there was one conversation he was having with one of his students, where his students showed him a newspaper, sort of like a photo of a holy monk and then the photo you can see that person sort of, there's a pile of money in front of that holy person, and the holy person is doing this. So they showed him to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, bring that photographer, put that money in front of me, and I'll go like this. And they were thinking, really? And he was trying to make a point that I'll take this money, but it's not for me. This is not mine for me to take. I'll use this in service of others. So sometimes we have this idea that, okay, if anything's material, okay, I'm supposed to sort of turn my face away. And so the point here is, when one understands that everything belongs to Krishna and it can be used for that purpose, then one is rightfully situated in one's renunciation. So coming back to our spiritual bypassing, we can sort of develop that tendency of sort of artificially giving things up, which could have been used in our spiritual advancement, in our spiritual journey. So in this way, we try to sort of rise to some higher levels of advancement. And my teacher often loves to talk about this. He says that these higher levels of spiritual advancement are not something to be reached out and grabbed, or just something that's there available for you to sort of just, it's like a go-getter attitude. You go for it, it's just there. So these higher levels of spiritual advancement, they descend upon us. They have to be bestowed upon us. And this comes through a process, through acquiring qualities of humility and patience. So when one takes through a spiritual process through patience and humility, then one, through this process, these higher levels of spiritual advancement, they descend upon us. And finally, maybe I can conclude with one or two more slides. Is that okay? Any thoughts so far? Anything you want to add? Yeah.
Well, I just like the idea of not approaching spiritual life the way that one would approach material life, like setting goals and like creating plans, and like I'm gonna do this by this date, or like letting it come to you.
Yes, but I also like to add that we can have goals in spiritual life. It's not sort of discouraged to have goals. But then we also consider that there are other factors that are also involved. So in the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that one who thinks that they are the only doer or the only factor in getting the results accomplished is not in complete knowledge. So setting goals is fine, but there are other factors which help us reach that goal. So as long as we are acknowledging that, Krishna says there are 5 factors which accomplish action and so on in chapter 18. So yes, setting goals is not a problem, but if one thinks that I'm the only sole doer, then that's again goes back to that me mindset that it's all up to me and I can sort of do it on my own endeavor without considering other people and other things that help us. So wait, there was another. Okay, yeah, I think I skipped a few slides ahead. So before I show this slide, I wanted to sort of add this one point that in the Vedic tradition, there's a nice story in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Some of you might not be familiar with Srimad Bhagavatam. Anybody not know Srimad Bhagavatam? Anyway, I'll break it down. So in this really wonderful book, Srimad Bhagavatam, there's a really elevated heavenly personality. Brahma is considered like the topmost of the most evolved. And he goes across a situation where he's really sort of, he finds himself in an embarrassing situation where he tries to test Krishna, who's the supreme personality. So, and in this story of how Brahma, the topmost being in this sort of material world, he's really embarrassed and he's sort of brought down to a more humble position. He's sort of offering his prayers to Krishna, and in that prayers he's telling Krishna that although me being in such a elevated position, I'm in one sense considered one of the most evolved of beings. My mind is completely clear from any sort of material contamination. And even someone like me or people like me cannot fully understand your transcendental glory. He's speaking to Krishna, and your material energies. And he's saying even someone like me cannot understand spiritual concepts completely to the fullest. And then he says a really interesting thing. But someone who's staying at their own level, who's sincere and who's really honest, can actually understand you if they give their speculative tendencies. So this is a really beautiful verse. Again, my teacher loves this. Jnane prayasam udapasya namanta eva jivanti sanmukharitam bhavadiya vartam. Sthane stita means being in your own situation. Shrutigatam tanuvan manobir. Yat prayaso jita jitopyasi trayas trilokyam. So should I read the English, or anybody would like to read? So he says that those who, even while remaining situated in their established social positions, sthane sita, being in your social positions, throw away the process of speculative knowledge, meaning all these concocted ideas we bring in spiritual life, thinking if I do this, I'm more advanced, if I dress like this, I'm more... So he says, staying in their position, they throw away the process of speculative knowledge, and with their body, words, and mind, offer all respects to descriptions of your personality and activities, dedicating their lives to these narrations, which are vibrated by you personally and by your pure devotees, certainly conquer your lordship, although you are otherwise unconquerable by anyone within the three worlds. So again, he's making the same point that although I'm considered such a spiritually evolved person, even I haven't been able to understand you because I was sort of artificially, spiritually bypassing to a level which was way above my pay grade. And now I'm sort of humbled, and I've sort of take few steps lower. So he's saying one who stays in their established social positions, but being honest with themselves, can actually do better than someone like me. And the last slide, before the last slide, any thoughts? Anything you want to add so far?
It's a beautiful picture.
That's Brahma. That's the spiritually evolved being I was saying on the left, and he's offering these prayers to Krishna. And because of his sort of spiritual bypassing, he sort of fails to acknowledge Krishna and spiritual truths, and he becomes really humble. There's a whole story behind that where he becomes really bewildered and finds himself in a really embarrassing situation, and he's sort of confronted, he's forced to accept of his faux pas, as we say, this embarrassed sort of situation. So I'd like to conclude with this one point, with this verse from Bhagavad Gita. I think this is the one. Anybody like to read this? I see two hands.
Go ahead.
By following his qualities of work, every man can become perfect. It is better to engage in one's own occupation, even though one may perform it imperfectly, than to accept another's occupation and perform it perfectly. Duties prescribed according to one's nature are never affected by sinful reactions.
So this is at the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, the same book that we were referring to earlier, the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna. And towards the end, Krishna is making this point that it is better to engage in one's own occupation, one's own duty, even though one may perform it imperfectly, rather than trying to be at a higher level and do it imperfectly. So anyway, with this, maybe like to sort of leave some time for any reflections, any comments, or anything that you want to add or subtract or whatever.
Thank you for the talk.
Sure.
A thought came to me that spiritual bypassing could be because of the level that you're at, the mode of nature that you're at. So one who's in the ignorant tamasic phase is not going to understand someone in the sattvic stage. Yeah, that came to me.
Yeah, it's interesting, like I mentioned before, like in many faith traditions there are leaders who after 20, 30 years, they just leave, because they were sort of trying to from one level, they were trying to sort of put themselves in another higher level, which is unrealistic, and they have to sort of take a few steps back. So, any other points of what spiritual bypassing means to you? If at any point I have sort of not addressed, what else could spiritual bypassing mean? Yeah, maybe two hands, yes.
Well, I was just gonna say that it's interesting because I've heard that as time progresses, actually our physical health, although we see like people really like suffer a lot from like cancer or just different illnesses, as time goes on, it will be more of like a mental health issue. Like people will be more disturbed than they are physically sick.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting that even like just in mainstream media, it's like people are really pushing for mental health.
Yeah.
And the spiritual bypassing, from what I hear, it's like a lot to do with pride, like our mentality that no, I don't have to be like this, I'm not bad, I'm not like broken or wrong or whatever. And it's like, pushing away. But even in mainstream media, it's like, it's important for us to first acknowledge it before we can overcome it. And so spiritually speaking too, we can even expect that I probably will feel proud. And part of doing something that is good, or like in the mode of goodness, is that you do feel good. You feel like you're, if you're giving in charity or you've cleaned something and nobody even asked you, and you feel like, wow, I'm just so good, good to the world. And so we can expect that pride might be there, and just kind of prevent it before it consumes us.
I like the point you mentioned, one has to acknowledge before one addresses it. I don't know how you worded it, but something to that extent. That was a nice point. Chaitanya Charan, one of the nice monks in this tradition, he says that the World Health Organization said in this decade the biggest sort of crisis issue humans will face is mental health issue. That's like such a prevalent sort of challenge we face. Any other thoughts? Yes, you had a point.
I like your talk about this, and I just had two reflections. One of them, you asked for a good definition for spiritual bypassing. I think the first thing that came to my mind when I heard the term was climbing up another step before you're stable on the first step. So like Srila Prabhupada would give this example of you learn so much calculus and so much arithmetic, but then if you first in kindergarten you got 2 + 2 = 5, then everything you learn based off that is going to be wrong. So I just think that a spiritual bypassing could look at it is that you forgot the basics, but you're learning all calculus and arithmetic. Yeah. But then what will happen is that you may get the calculus right for some time, but then eventually you're going to have to somehow force it into you that 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah. And
you have to learn that lesson the easy way or the hard way. So better to go on blow the balloon instead of the balloon pop. Yeah. So I thought of that.
Yeah. I like the analogy of climbing stairs.
Yeah.
You can't skip. I mean, you can, but as long as you have bigger legs. But so it's interesting. And also we talked about how when we sort of have that escapist mindset, you're frustrated with certain material situation you wanted to enjoy that couldn't happen, we took to spiritual life. And then at a later point when those prospects return, the opportunity to enjoy, that's when again we are confronted with this crisis, and then we sort of revert back and forth. So better to be in a more sustainable platform, and that's where Karma Yoga, Krishna talks about how it's better to be, like Vishnu Chakravarti explains, it's better to be a sincere grihastha than an insincere sannyasi, like a holy man who's like dishonest. It's better to be a more honest family person. Any other thoughts? Okay, thank you so much for coming. I hand it back to...
Give a big round of applause to everyone.